Welcome back to the program. It's time for our panel now. I'm joined by Liberal MP David Coleman here live in the studio. We appreciate your company.
Good to be here,
and
Peter.
Christian Kerr is joining us live from Melbourne from the Australian newspaper. Thanks for your company, Christian.
G'day, Peter.
All right, I'll come to you first, though, David, if I can. Now, we had a conversation, I think it was an Australian Financial Review opinion piece that you did, calling for adjustments to capital gains tax. They were included, as I understand it, pretty much chapter and verse in the innovation statement. Did you know that at the time?
No, I didn't. It's an issue that I've thought is important for a long time, and so basically what I was advocating was that we abolish capital gains tax for investments in startups. The theory being that less capital gains tax means more investment, which means more startups, which means more jobs. And that broad principle's been adopted in the innovation statement.
So help us with the process of this, because I'm fascinated by this, because you're on the backbench, you're free to spitball ideas to a certain extent at least. You're doing one here on something that I know you've got not just an interest in, but have got, I guess, an historical understanding about with your pre-parliamentary career as well. We've talked about it. You've been discussing this in a series of forums, no doubt internally as well. What's the process? Because Christopher Pyne takes over as Innovation Minister. Malcolm Turnbull very supportive of all of these concepts, being more agile and all the rest of it. Do you go to them? Do they come to you? How does it work? What's the behind the scenes?
Oh, sure. Well, look, obviously the decision maker is ultimately the Minister and the Prime Minister. But it's certainly up to you as a backbencher to put forward things that you believe in. And
so you went to them?
Well, initially I obviously advocated the idea and had some discussions, and which were referred to in the original op-ed I wrote. But you know, obviously a number of my colleagues have put forward ideas on various topics over the past year or two, and that was something. And
they're not all listened to, but you were listened to on this. So tell us how the sausage is made. So what happens?
Look, I wouldn't want to imply, Peter, that this is solely down to me, but it is certainly something I felt strongly about.
So good.
And I think that it's something that has been done. Something similar was done in the UK recently, and with the focus on innovation and wanting to get more startups off the ground, it's just common sense, to be honest, because the cost of the budget of getting rid of capital gains tax for startups is actually quite modest, but the benefit in terms of helping these people to raise money will be, I believe, very substantial. So I think there was a certain logic to it, and probably people other than myself were raising it as well. Some of the industry groups, the startup groups, and so on raised it as well. So
forget them. Take all the credit yourself. Let me bring Christian Kerr in though. You've been around the political traps. You know Christopher Pyne quite well. You've been a political staffer yourself at various moments in time before your media career. Is this an example of good government, that you've got backbenchers floating ideas that are positive, I suppose, in the public sphere, and ultimately having them taken up by government when they decide to have a larger package in that broader policy space?
Look, I think this is exactly what government should do. I think good government really depends on having an active backbench, a backbench that is just putting ideas forward, flying kites, but doing it in a tactically smart way. Flying kites that aren't going to get tangled up, cause problems for the government, but really just floating ideas that ministers can seize on. It's incredibly rewarding for backbenchers as well. I mean, it's good government from every point of view. It fosters a real collegiate spirit in the ranks of the government. It means that ideas are being floated that might necessarily be coming from the bureaucracy or from lobby groups or whatever, but with the imprimatur of your own side of politics. And I think it's a really good part of collegial government.
Christian Kerr, does the public debate over Islam fall into the same category?
Well, yes, it does, and I think that's another one actually that we should look at how that's been handled, because I don't think it has been handled so deftly. I mean, I think this is one of those issues where you're just going to have some very, very heartfelt views that will be controversial, that will be difficult. At the same time, it's one where there's there's such an effort to try and take the heat out of it. It's again a matter of management. Just as you sort of pat backbenchers on the head for some ideas, you do need to caution them over others. It's how you do it that matters, and I think it's been done rather clumsily over the last few weeks.
Well, I'm glad you said that about it's how you do it that matters, Christian Kerr. Let me bring you back in, David Coleman. I mean, the Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, made some public comments around, Andrew Hastie the new Liberal MP for Canning, and the way that the head of ASIO had contacted him. He really made it sort of sound like, oh yes, I've passed the text message on, and the head of ASIO, who of course is a former commander of his more junior fellow officer, Andrew Hastie, I thought he could have some advice that he could talk to him about, words to that effect. That's a bit condescending, isn't it?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so at all, actually, Peter. I think it's quite reasonable for senior public servants to express views on areas in which they have expertise. And if
he's trying to almost lord it over Andrew Hastie, that the former head of ASIO was a former, more senior commander in the SAS than Andrew Hastie himself.
No, that's your characterisation with which I would not agree.
It's actually the way it was put to me by another Liberal MP.
Right. Well, look, no, I think it's quite appropriate for senior members of the public service to express their views on areas that they have expertise in. And look, everyone's entitled. I mean, MPs are entitled to have different views, and the fact that the ASIO chief expresses himself in a certain way doesn't mean MPs have to entirely agree with him, but it's difficult to see what's wrong with a person with expertise expressing a view, and then it's up to individual MPs as to how they express themselves.
It's a big call though, isn't it, Christian Kerr, if the expert expresses a view and then the MP says, well, you know what, I just don't agree with that, bang, and then does the opposite of what they've been advised to do.
Well, also, it's a bit of a big call when the expert happens to be the head of ASIO. I mean, we tend to be pretty discreet about our intelligence agencies, and we seem to have had a fair bit of indiscretion over this entire episode. I mean, one of the things that I think we've already learned about Andrew Hastie is that he is an impressive public performer. I mean, the way he appeared before the media on the night of the leadership challenge and what he actually said there, I thought, you know, put on my old spin doctor's hat, wearing my journo's hat, I thought that was a really impressive performance. He was obviously a very high quality candidate, and I think he's got every opportunity to be a parliamentarian of some real calibre. This whole episode, it's just a little clumsy, because again, it just goes back to the way you do things and the way in which, probably most importantly of all, they can be mischaracterised. And I think that's been the issue with this episode.
Well, David Coleman, it's a fair point though, isn't it, that I don't have a problem with MPs speaking out on, frankly, anything that they have a view on. I mean, that's their role. I mean, that's what you want MPs, particularly backbenchers who have a relative amount of freedom to do. Here's my question though. If they're going to talk out directly contra the sort of advice that they're getting from sources like ASIO, the head of ASIO no less, isn't it also then incumbent on the MP to explain why they think it's worthwhile or appropriate to reject the advice of the expert? Not just to talk about why they think the issue is important, but why the explicit logic of the expert, which is that you are going to make it harder for us to conduct counter-terrorism operations. Isn't it incumbent on the MP to explain why they aren't concerned about that, why that's overstated, or why that's something that they're prepared to ignore?
Well, I think ultimately we're all responsible for the way we express ourselves and for defending our views, and I don't think there's anything wrong with MPs expressing their views. I think obviously on this issue of counter-terrorism, you know, the question, the ultimate question is, what is the goal? The goal is to minimise the prospect of any further terrorist incidents.
Well, if that's the goal, though, the experts, ASIO, tell us that MPs shouldn't inflame relations with the Islamic community. That's what they're saying. So if that's the ultimate goal, as you point out, David Coleman, then these MPs that are speaking out, who a lot of us might agree with, shouldn't be, should they? Oh
no, as I said, I think everyone has the right to express themselves as they see fit.
But if that's the ultimate goal, don't they then also need to explain why they don't accept the experts who say that goal is being harmed by them speaking out?
They have to express themselves in the way they see fit, and people will assess that accordingly. I think it's very important to focus on what do we do to best minimise the threat of further terrorist incidents. There's no question that working closely with the Islamic community is a very important part of that.
So you personally, therefore, would err on the side of caution?
Look, I think it's very important to work with the Islamic community. In my own electorate, there are a number of Islamic community leaders who do a lot of work behind the scenes that, you know, perhaps doesn't get focused on in the media in terms of seeking to work with authorities on these issues. But you've got to go to the substance here, and the substance is the threat of terrorism. And the question is, we as a government obviously are focused on doing everything we sensibly can to minimise the impact of those incidents occurring again.
See, Christian Kerr, I'm at risk of getting splinters on this one because I really do sit on the fence on it because I'm torn. It's a really vexing issue. On the one hand, I think when the experts tell you something, particularly as directly as we seem to be getting told this by ASIO, it's hard not to take their advice and not to listen because they are the ones, obviously, with the direct line of sight on the counter-terrorism operations and what they believe does or doesn't help or hinder the situation. At the same time as that, though, I can well understand some of the comments that are being made by people, MPs for the government, who are expressing their concerns about there being a bit of a culture of quiet about some of the problems in the Islamic community, particularly amongst radicals. Now, as I say, I'm sitting on the fence on this one, but those two things don't gel. It's a difficult, vexing issue, Christian Kerr.
Oh, look, it is a vexing issue, but I think there are very much matters of local emphasis here. I mean, one of the big things that has happened since the change of Prime Minister has obviously been all these moves to take the heat out of so much of this debate. But there's still a debate nonetheless. But I think you've got to look at some of the context of the debate and say the debate in Andrew Hastie's electorate up around Mandurah way, I mean, that's going to play very differently to the debate in the southwestern suburbs of Sydney. So there is space for nuance, and there should be space for nuance, and I think that's something that really needs to be remembered in all of this.
Well, let me ask you, David Coleman, if I can, on another issue entirely. The ABC, now it was reported, pretty widely reported, that the former Prime Minister Tony Abbott described the Q&A program at least as a lefty lynch mob in the party room. I'm sure that's true. It was reported. How could it not be true? The other issue, which we do know is true because we heard the words when he was interviewed on TV, was Eric Abetz talking about the first goal of the new managing director of the ABC really needs to be to fix up their lefty bias. Do you share those concerns? I
think there's been some legitimate concerns about the coverage of the ABC, particularly in the current affairs division, and some of the things we saw in Q&A this year, most notoriously obviously the Zaki Mallah incident. So yeah, I think it is a reasonable thing for the incoming managing director to focus on.
Okay, if it is though, then I've got to ask you the follow-up question because we see this in today's Australian, the headline, journalism the lowest priority for the ABC head. That's a concern, isn't it?
Well, look, I mean, I think that's from a list of a checklist from an interview process, so I'm not sure I'd be getting too focused on that particular headline. But the job of the boss of the ABC has lots of responsibilities, but ensuring the confidence of the broad Australian community is a big part of it, and an even-handed, steady approach in the coverage of current affairs is a very important part of that, and I'm sure that the new managing director will turn her attention to that when she takes the role.
Christian Kerr, what's your view on this issue around the ABC? Because certainly at the Australian newspaper, which you write for, and so do I, there'd be no prospect of an editor-in-chief not having a strong journalistic background. Is it different for a managing director of the ABC, given, I suppose, that they do have a news director as well?
No, I think it is a problem. I mean, if you're going to have the two jobs as being the managing director and editor-in-chief, you've got to be able to act as editor-in-chief. I think we have the ABC really butting up against Mitch Fifield at the moment. We've had the chair, Jim Spiegelman, effectively say, no, we're not going to do what Malcolm Turnbull asked us to do when he was communications minister. We're not going to separate the two roles. I think you really need to have not only someone who can manage, but someone who can take responsibility for editorial decisions. And so that's really what has been missing in the ABC in so much of this debate over its performance in recent years. Everything just gets explained away in amorphous public service terms which are utterly meaningless. I mean, the ABC is an important national institution. Its intellectual rigour is part of that. And when you see something like Q&A being passed off as serious current affairs, when it's effectively infotainment for the twittering classes, really there is something missing there from the point of view of editorial leadership.
Christian Kerr, always appreciate your insights. Thanks for your company this year. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. We'll talk to you again in January. And to David Coleman, member for Banks, we appreciate your company as always here on Sky News. Have a Merry Christmas yourself.
You too, Peter. Thank you.
Thanks very much.